Okay. So, welcome. Our first guest in this digital information about European organizations and networks that Innlandet is member of is AEBR, Association of European Border Regions. We are very happy to have Secretary General Martin Guillermo Ramirez with us today. Welcome. We look forward to your presentation of AEBR for Innlandet County Council, as well as our colleagues in the administration. Please, Martin, the stage is yours.
It's a pleasure that you invite me to present a little bit more in depth what we do, thinking of the colleagues from Innlandet who were not able to attend our events last year, that we organize our events in Trysil. It's an excellent opportunity, and also give us the image of a region which is taken seriously, their participation in our network, which is the basic of our work. What we do mostly is we come from the point that in the process of integration in our continent, which is something unique, the bottom level has not been taken seriously into account. So integration is not only agreements of nation states in summits, but it's also going to the borders, where in Europe we have a very complicated history and try to overcome prejudices, historical differences, and to look the elements of union and integration. Sometimes it's simply some calculation that is much cheaper to do things together than to fight each other. It's much cheaper to share services than to have mirror services that sometimes with one hospital could be enough for the whole cross-border region and a business center. And we find out border areas in Europe where we don't have the hospital, we don't have the business center, or we have two or three. So a better coordination of services, thinking of the citizens, thinking of the public money that we are spending, and building up bridges, any kind of bridges across borders. As we have developed during centuries, any kind of obstacles, any kind of differences. Now we have to be open. And for the purpose, the objective at the end is a proper integration and with based on the principles of the foundation of the European Union. And of course, subsidiarity, decentralization, all the elements that have to do with the development of local and regional authorities, with the particular context of border areas. So our story is a story of removing obstacles. Sometimes they are not perceived, only they are perceived when they are in, but when they are removed, sometimes people are thinking that this is just an effect of European integration, but it's a consequence. So we can count already for 75 years of formal cooperation. The first structures for cooperation, the first Euro regions, were created at the western part of Germany in the 50s already. And but we have formal programs for cooperation Interreg for 35 years, not that much. The border regions have been considered laboratories for European integration for all these reasons. And the resultant at the end, the output is the generation of trust, institutional trust between the citizens, which is the basic glue to build up a solid integration process. Everything started, this cooperation, in the areas where the Second World War was strongest, the German-French border, or the borders along the Rhine, from Switzerland to the Netherlands. There, where you can find a lot of cemeteries with thousands of crosses of the soldiers who lost their lives there, and also in these areas where you can find the highest concentration of cross-border cooperation structures. As long as the members of the EU, the new members, were joining the Iberian countries in '86, and the wave of incorporations in the '90s, you could see that also cross-border structures were created in these countries. First informal, then based on single projects, and today we can count of huge constructions for cross-border cooperation in some parts of Europe, third or fourth generation of cooperation. Some 20, 25 years ago, other processes of integration in other continents paid a look not only to the supranational process in Europe, but also to these things happening across the borders. And today we can also count with many processes that have been inspired in the European ones, and we have been driving some of them, especially in South and Central America. But there are a few more processes in Africa under very complicated circumstances promoted by the African Union, where we also try at least to share our experience so far. This started a long time ago, and the structures who are active where you have in Scandinavia 12 cross-border structures. Some of them are also pioneers coming from the 60s, 70s. I'm thinking of ARCO and others which are very famous ones, like Øresund, that they changed to Greater Copenhagen, and of course all the Swedish, Norwegian, and Finnish structures which are working for decades. Around 300 structures and regions, let's say institutional players in cross-border cooperation in Europe, we can count today, coming from the 20 pioneers. They can be Euro regions, working communities, cross-border cabinets, agencies, EGTCs, which is the legal instrument under the public EU law, ECGs, which is a similar instrument designed by the Council of Europe. Unfortunately, not a single one has been built up to now, but the EGTCs, there are more than 80. And then we have the macro-regional strategies and metropolitan cross-border cooperation units that complicate a little bit the picture. But this is the type of structures we are working with together, of course, with the regions, with the regional governments in border areas, and agrupations of municipalities. We are an organization of regions, and we try to concentrate on that. The municipal level should be integrated in the regional. We try to provide results by supporting our members in their strategies, promoting trust and shared responsibility and accountability. The Euro region is the basic unit of cross-border cooperation in Europe, which has evolved to different types, as you see before. And these Euro regions, cross-border structures, your cross-border agencies in Scandinavia, all of them are much more than a structure or an agent of cooperation. They can be, in some places, the name is used for the area, for the region, at the end, for the mission, and even I would say in some places it is a brand in itself. The Euro regions has managed after the Euro regions and similar structures to create brands related to integration, understanding, trust, etc. And in our association, they share similar type of problems, sometimes very particular, but we try to paint a joint picture to the European institutions and national authorities so we can get also support to implement different type of initiatives. We try to influence in the EU legislation, national ones, but also to get own programs and projects. Interreg was designed and started in 1989, the first programs in 1990, and it was a result of proposals, documents, and discussions between the association and the European institutions. The same happened with the EGTCs and with other achievements. We have been always behind, together with European institutions, showing what is going on in the ground, testing if the measures that were designed in Brussels are useful for border regions. And in these processes, we have gained, I think, an enormous element of trust also with the European institutions, because we still receive requests to implement certain things on behalf of the EU institutions. And this is a growing matter. I will say a couple of words about these specific initiatives at the end of the presentation. We work on all the phases of cross-border cooperation, and we simplify them with this, taking into account and trying to recommend not to start the house with the roof, even if sometimes it's useful. But we consider that there are some things that have to be done one after the other. First, we have to be able to know more about our neighbor before starting to cooperate, especially if it is a complex process of cooperation. Then we have to make consultations to know more and also to test if our ideas are compatible with the ideas of our neighbor. Then we have to harmonize without being too obsessed with the harmonization, but there is a minimum level of coordination of regulations across borders. Otherwise, the differentials are too heavy. Even if differentials could be okay in cross-border environments in order to facilitate the economy, for the provision of services, we need to harmonize because sometimes we have different types of rights across the border, depending on where you live, to have more or less rights. This is not thinkable in the EU. And if all of this is working okay, at the end we will have the utopia with the fully integrated territory that is considered a single area by policymakers, by the citizens, investors, etc. This will be the objective, which sometimes even we could achieve. A few maps. Here you have the maps of the AEBR from 1971 to 2011. So you can see the progress, and especially when we go to 2011, we stop here doing paper maps because it was becoming impossible to read it. But we keep it in order because there were not big differences, and then you can have an overview of the type of how it is distributed all over Europe. The red lines means ABR members. The green ones are not. Things have changed little in the last years about the membership, but there are a few in and out. But the main difference is these frames, which are in color purple. These are the EGTCs. They started to be created in 2006-7. And by the time of this map, there were around 22. Today, there are 86. You can imagine, if we put them in the map, it would be impossible to read. But it's very interesting to see some details. For instance, I think I have a couple of maps afterwards, yes. I will show you a couple of details to see how complex this is. You can also pay a look to the Scandinavian, where most of the cross-border structures that you know well, I think they are represented in this map. So with the first Euro regions, they created the AEBR. The first legislation where our founders were very active was the Madrid Outline Convention, where another series of Euro regions was created. Then in Interreg in 1990 has been the instrument from the EU to facilitate cooperation also with the associated member states and even with the external borders, with third countries, including Russia until 2022. There were Interreg programs or similar programs that now are integrated in Interreg. The EGTCs I already mentioned, and now we have the last achievement was this year, the Bridge for EU, which is an instrument of the EU to solve legal and administrative obstacles to cross-border cooperation. So the icing on the cake. Member states are still discussing how to implement this regulation in their legislation. About the AEBR, here you can see the map again, and here some figures. We started with around 10 members in 1971, and today we have around 100. Why being a member of AEBR? Well, sometimes people say, Martin, we don't join AEBR because why do we need to pay a fee if you're going to do the work anyway? This is true. But we need a critical mass of members because it's not only today we are implementing EU projects, and with this we are able to finance our organization. So we are not that much in the need of getting your fees, but the fees of our members give us independency and autonomy. And this is, I think, very important. But much more important is the map of members that we present when we do lobby, when we go in front of a commissioner and we say, look, we think that the Interreg program should not be renationalized and the management should be decentralized, because this is the key issue of the commitment that local and regional authorities have with EU money in order to implement this complex process, which is happening in hundreds of territories all over Europe. Then we say, but who are you? Well, we present the map of members, and well, they listen to us. So it's very important to have a wide map. Then this makes complex to respond to the needs of everybody. But here is the trick of AEBR, to be able to find synergies everywhere. We are very experienced on that. And most of our members are happy to be there to discuss regularly with other colleagues from other parts of Europe, to make study visits, to do joint projects, to think together, even to dream together. We do it a lot. And I would say that some of the dreams we had a few decades ago today are a reality, certainly. We say that we are pathologic optimists because you cannot be a pessimist when you're dealing with this. We are very privileged because we are all working all the time on the good news of Europe, on trying to avoid conflicts, on trying to consolidate relationships, building trust, building Europe from the bottom. And I think, is there anything better? I don't think so. So it's we are well considered in the different institutions, also nation states, and all in other continents. As I can mention, the number of people following us from other continents only grows, of course, also in Europe. Here you have a list of members. You can see just to give you an idea, here you have around 100, which are active members paying a fee, etc. The ones in red, they have announced their interest to join, and probably they will do next week when we have our General Assembly in Gorizia, which is a cross-border town between Italy and Slovenia. Some details of the map here in the map in the left side, you can see how many all these structures are Euro regions or cross-border structures around the Czech Republic, Austria, Hungary, or Germany, or in the Benelux. You can see the complexity of structures, but each of them with their own personality. In the right side, you have the more detail of the first Euro regions, especially at the German-Dutch border. Some of them founded in the late 50s of the last century. We are not the only ones, of course. We have also, but the AEBR is the only European network. The Mission Opérationnelle Transfrontalière is also a network of cross-border structures and border regions in the borders of France, which is quite wide. Chesky is a similar organization in Hungary, and they coordinate Central European cross-border cooperation. They are also members of AEBR as a network. And then we have the Transfrontier Euro Institute network in Kiel, which is a network of researchers dealing with cross-border issues, and we try to interact with them. We try to find a good coordination between the academia, policymaking, civil society, and also with the enterprise. So we try to activate a quadruple helix in order that the politicians, they can use good evidence from the science when implementing policies, listening to the citizens and to the enterprises, to their needs, and to try to consolidate good policies in cross-border areas. There are other institutions. Norregio for Scandinavia is a classic, very good institute making very serious research. And then the EU institutions, they have, in some cases, specific units to address or to follow cross-border cooperation. The region, the European Commission, have the border focal point. The Committee of the Regions had the EGTC platform, which now evolves to a wider platform including all the regions. Next week, we will have an annual event in Gorizia of all the structures. The European Parliament, the REGI committee also follows this, and the Council of Europe, which is the wider organization with 47 members. Also, they have a Congress of Local and Regional Authorities, which tackles cross-border cooperation from time to time. We try to be present in all of this, especially through our political representatives. But also our unit, our secretariat is always in contact for the specific details. Just to give you, this is the type of also of the institutions we have to deal with. It is particularly the Council of Europe and the European Union, but there are more we have to take into account very often. Well, the Benelux, or the Nordic Council, or the Visegrad Group, and then to address them because they also have a strategic role in the development of the different territories. So we have to be well aware of working in this business. We thought that we were in a continuum, more cooperation, more integration, more wealth for our territories, but then different circumstances came and show us that nothing can be taken for granted. First, the migration phenomena some 10 years ago provoked the closing of many borders. Then the pandemic also provoked the closing of many borders and the opening of many borders a few days or 24 hours later, because some member states discovered that there was a cross-border dynamic that they could not close overnight. And then, of course, the war in Ukraine and other conflicts are making many member states to rethink their borders, even to reestablish border controls, etc. This is not a good solution, but we have to be able to provide answers and reply to this. So what we try is to continue working, developing the knowledge triangle in border areas, the triple or even quadruple helix that I mentioned before, but especially to try to fix people to the territory. Everybody should be able to leave their territory if they wish, but they also have the right to stay. So we would like that the talent from the regions is not disappearing, but even if they leave to know more, to learn, they should be able to come back to the territories. They should be attractive, particularly border areas. And for this, especially in rural, depopulated territories, there is a lot to do. And all of this, of course, this, as I said, we were thinking it was a continuum, but then the pandemic came, and then we discovered plenty of border closings, plenty of disruption in our work. But I think we reacted, the regions reacted very well, and then we came out from the pandemic stronger, definitely. In any case, the programs for the current period were discussed, and I remember the first discussions wanted to reduce the number of funds for Interreg, but finally we managed a similar budget as in the previous period. And now the discussions on the next funding period after 27 shows that the allocation of funds for Interreg is a bit higher. And in the first proposal of the Commission, you can see already there this amount, which is even a bit higher than in the previous. So we consider that Interreg, European Territorial Cooperation, has got integrated in the DNA of the EU, and in the first draft proposal of budget, Interreg is already there, and it looks with a similar architecture than in the previous period. So we are satisfied with the amounts. What we are now is following very closely if the architecture of Interreg programs is going to be affected. It looks like not that much, but we have to be very attentive for that. So we have tried to get some conclusions for our work, and it's, well, a few very simple but very clear. Supranational integration does not guarantee the cohesion of all territories, and particularly in very diverse territories like the European one. And then we need a positive discrimination for sub-territories, and this is particularly so for rural border areas. That's why we need cross-border structures who activate trust, coordination, harmonization, etc. Then we know that we cannot take one example and translate it into the next territory. Every border is unique, and we need deep knowledge. So it's very important to work with the people on the ground. You cannot design things for the border areas in Brussels and implement them. You need the people on the ground. And then that's why we have to invest in structures which are already existing for cooperation, even if they don't have a legal form. We should be able to show the added value of cooperation very soon, because just putting people together, it's an asset on itself. Of course, there are plenty of challenges, but not everybody is the same as other. There are borders in Europe where we still are working on the generation of a minimum level of trust, while in others, trust is running, the challenges are different. Or even when we thought that we had all the answers, like the famous Scandinavian cooperation, then Mr. Putin decided to activate his armed forces, and then suddenly we have to see how Scandinavia is talking more and more about defense, which is logic. But we can say we cannot take anything for granted, especially in these times. In any case, there are also many opportunities, and they have been demonstrated with evidences from cooperation in the last year. We have to work against psychological borders and mental maps, which is also complicated. That's why we pay a lot of attention to the talking about cross-border cooperation and the neighbor in schools from the very early stages, with maps without borders or maps showing the cross-border territory, so to remove the mental borders that are installed in the minds from the early ages. And of course, we have new tasks. Some borders are very much disrupted by the migratory phenomena, the conflicts in the Eastern and in the Mediterranean. And of course, we now are obsessed with the crisis management and risk prevention because the polycrisis world in which we are living, it's also affecting particularly the borders, the external borders, of course, but even the internal borders, because the open borders concept is becoming under question by many groups which are very influential. Then, of course, we have a duty with Ukraine. There are cross-border structures with the participation of Ukrainian colleagues, which have to change priorities, but we have to keep on working and even thinking on the post-conflict world. A few slides on AEBR, but it's a summary of what I have already said. But for you, this presentation is at your full disposal. And I have an extended version with more details of this presentation that I use for universities when I have to make a long one. This is, I'm coming to the end. These are our tasks, lobbying, supporting cross-border cooperation and the structures, information, thinking, preparing projects, training, designing strategies. Then these are the EU institutions I mentioned before with some detail of the different departments. We also have task forces depending on the needs. We activate task forces, we deactivate them. We are now activating the Interreg one, but there is one on cross-border health and on cross-border labor markets, which is always open. Another one on cross-border culture. We consider that we have to start with culture cooperation, and then the economy will come later. But with culture, the knowledge of the language of the neighbor, we build this trust in which, at the end, we will put our money, we will share our funds with the neighbor. But first, we have to have some trust on them, and they should have trust on us. And you can see also on data, cross-border data is another issue for us, etc. We have a few, and of course we can create task forces on demand of our members if there is any need. There was once that we have to do it on island regions or maritime, mountain regions, etc. Here, every year we take a priority and we develop it during the year besides our current business. And then with the annual conference, then we try to consolidate and share all the information achieved. Here you have a list of the latest events. The last one was in Innlandet, in Trysil, and the topic was cross-border resilience, cooperation versus security, and also energy. Surprise, and that we are talking about that in Scandinavia. Then, what are our priorities? Well, today we are dealing with, of course, all these tasks, lobbying, whatever, but we have some projects that we are implementing for the last year, which are, one of them is concentrated on the future, trying to activate youth, young activists of cross-border cooperation. So we are deploying volunteers in Interreg programs and projects. So far, we have deployed almost 1,200, 1,200 volunteers all over Europe. All over the programs, eligible territories, and Interreg, we also have programs in the Caribbean, for instance. So even some fortunate volunteers, they have been deployed in the Caribbean. Others are deployed, most of them in Europe, in continental Europe, of course. B Solutions is concentrated on the present. B Solutions try to identify obstacles to cross-border cooperation from a legal or administrative nature, and to provide solutions, at least define the obstacles and show the possible solution. We have identified and analyzed almost 200 of these obstacles. All of this is published and it's online. It's available online if you click on the B Solutions project and go to the library. And then now we are finishing Resilient Borders. It's a series of pilot actions on cross-border spatial planning and cross-border crisis management. We will present these 20 cases next week in Gorizia. And a similar project we are implementing, but is now running, on cross-border energy communities. We have opened a call, which is open until the 21st of November, in order to develop cross-border energy communities. Here we are not very ambitious. That's why we also accept quasi-cross-border energy communities, because we know how difficult it is to work cross-border on energy aspects. But we want our members to activate and to think high that even across borders, you can find autonomy in the provision, generation, etc. of energy. So we are exploring this. There are many more projects, but these are the most relevant ones. Here I have included some slides on the detail of B-Solutions, but it's not the topic of today. I'm in love with this project, but because it has made us more professional. And we have a network of more than 150 experts. It says 141, but there are 150 all over Europe, which are also very helpful for other purposes. But thanks to this project, we can have them in our loop. So it's an enormous wealth of languages, knowledge, expertise. Here you have the specific objectives and goals of B-Solutions, the thematic areas, but now we are concentrating on 4. Cross-border public services, activation of labor market and educational aspects which are related, the Green Deal, cross-border management of natural resources, and institutional cooperation, which is a box in which we can almost put everything when the obstacle is administrative. We have learned a lot, and we keep on learning, and now we know how little we know, because in every border you can find 100 of obstacles that they are completely different, even if basically are the same than in the neighboring border. The particularities of every border section makes these obstacles unique. And of course, some recommendations from B-Solutions that we are trying to implement, and they are not surprising. Capacity building is needed, multi-level engagement, and we need EU tools, because with the national instrument is not enough. You can hear the different publications that you can download on our website. This is the Interreg Volunteer Youth Program. Also, details can be found in the Interreg Youth, but you can also get in contact with our team. And there are other projects on cross-border public services, which I find amazing. We have done a catalog so far. 1,600 public services cross-border have been identified in Europe. Now the question is to see how are they working. Resilient borders, I already mentioned. This is the cross-border energy communities. I would like to insist the 21st of November is still open. And we know that there are not many cases submitted. So if you have an idea of a cross-border energy action with your neighbor, please come to us, because we can finance and put some experts to work with you in order to activate a cross-border energy community. And even, as I mentioned, we have done some work outside the EU, including Jerusalem, which is a long story that I would be delighted to explain to you, but we don't have the time. So it's a long story. There are a lot of elements we have. Of course, I can illustrate all the things I have explained today with publications, longer presentations, and specific meetings if anyone is interested. But our objective, as I said before, is to achieve a critical mass of activists thinking that cross-border cooperation is good for the territories. The added value is enormous. There is much to win on the political, institutional, socioeconomic, sociocultural sphere, but particularly on the overall integration. Here I have some historic sentences, which we don't have the time, but for you to know some of our founding fathers and our latest references, like Karl-Heinz Lambers, who has been the president of AEBR for many years. I think I went a bit out of the time, but try to summarize as much as possible to give you an overview and to let you with I hope, with the feeling of that you want to know more about AEBR. I hope it was interesting for you, and stay at disposal for questions or comments. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, and all the best of luck with the next week annual conference, and we will surely be in touch with you in our further work from the Innlandet County Council. Thank you.